Okay, so we finished up, for the most part, the electricity portion of the class, the oil portion of the class, and the natural gas portion of the class. So where do we go from here? Well, these markets are associated with externalities, and we have to think about how to deal with those externalities. If we're pretending that we're policymakers, we want to make the markets as efficient as possible. So how are we going to do that? So let's do a little review of welfare economics. So you probably learned most of this in 202 or environmental economics if you've taken that. What you see here is a simple supply and demand setting. Maybe this is demand for widgets, as economists like to talk about widgets. We have the marginal cost curve or the supply curve, and the demand curve, and the marginal benefit curve. Q star and P star are going to be the efficient quantities and prices because there's no externality in this market. So this is welfare without externalities first. We can impose a tax in this market. So let's think of this maybe as an income tax. So this is the market for income, I guess. We're imposing an income tax. We know that that's going to be inefficient. And so the income tax is the diffs. Well, here, let me write it out here. The income tax, or the tax in this market, is going to be the difference between what the buyers are going to be paying, PB, and the prices the sellers are receiving. So we're imposing a tax that creates a wedge, and that means that when the price the buyers are paying is PB, the quantity that they're going to consume is Q prime. So this quantity down here. The price the sellers receive is PS. All right, so let's do some welfare calculations with the areas in this graph. All right, so let's look at the little diagram or table to the right of the graph. We have before tax and after tax, consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total revenue or government revenue. The consumer surplus before the tax is going to be A, B, and C, the areas below the demand curve up to the prices that the buyers are paying, so that's P star. Before the tax, A, B, and C, consumer surplus. Producer surplus before the tax is going to be D, E, and F, or the price or the area below the price that is being paid, P star, down to the marginal cost curve. The government revenue before the tax is going to be 0 because there is no tax, so there's no revenue. After the tax, the consumer surplus is going to be the area A, just A, the area below the demand curve up to the price that buyers are paying. The producer surplus is going to be the area below the price that sellers are receiving down to the marginal cost curve, so that's just F. Remember, after the tax, we're only consuming Q prime. And then the total revenue is going to be the area of the tax, the wedge between PB and PS, all the way up to Q prime, so that's BD. So total surplus before the tax is going to be A, B, C, D, E, and F. We're going to add up the consumer and producer surplus. The total surplus after the tax is just going to be A, B, D, and F. And then the deadweight loss we can find by subtracting the two. So total surplus before minus total surplus after is going to be C and E. So it should come as no surprise that the deadweight loss in this market is, with a tax, is right there. C and E, the triangle C and E. So that we've just shown that if you impose a tax in an efficient market, it creates some deadweight loss. What about a market with externalities? Okay, so let's suppose we have this market here, welfare with externalities. So now we have a private marginal cost curve and a social marginal cost curve. In a market, even if we have an external, well, by definition, if we have an externality and we have not imposed the, or we have not taken care of the externality, then the market's going to set private marginal cost equal to demand, or marginal benefit. So the quantity consumed would be Q prime, and the price paid would be P prime. So this is if we had not internalized the externality. What happens if we internalize the externality, or we impose a tax that's equal to the size of the externality? So first of all, let's just define what the externality is. So the externality is going to be this wedge here. It's the difference, externality. The externality is the difference between the private marginal cost curve and the social marginal cost curve. And since I drew these these curves parallel, this stylized example is imposing that the externality cost is equal for every unit of the quantity consumed, or of the good consumed. So if this is electricity or energy of some sort, this says that every unit of electricity consumed imposes the same externalities, the difference between the social marginal cost and the private marginal cost. That could be the case if, well, there's a lot of reasons that might not be true. So it might be the case that the externality is increasing with the base of the externality in the market. So if the externality is pollution, the first unit of pollution might have very small damages, but the second and the third and maybe the millionth unit of pollution has very high damages. So it might not be the case that the externality is constant over the x-axis or the q-axis here. But for the sake of this diagram, that's what we're doing. So let's impose a tax in this market. The tax is going to make us consume up to Q star here. So the efficient quantity is not where the private marginal cost intersects the demand curve, it's where the social marginal cost intersects the demand curve. So that's going to be Q star. So if we impose the tax to get us to Q star, then the price the buyers are paying is going to be here, and the price the sellers are receiving is going to be here. Now let's put some areas in this. Or let's label these areas: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. All right, now we can start analyzing our welfare here. So let's fill out the table to the right. Consumer surplus before the tax is going to be A, B, C, D. So it's the area under the demand curve up to the price the buyers are paying. So that's going to be P prime in this case. The producer surplus before the tax is going to be the area under P prime down to the private marginal cost curve. Producer surplus is going to be F, G, H, I, and J. The total revenue, or the government revenue before the tax, is going to be 0, again, because there is no tax. The government's not collecting any revenue in this market. But the externality, we can, I'm going to cut off, so that's going to be externality. Make myself some room here. This is going to be a negative to our welfare. So this is going to be negative J, G, C, D, H, and E. Negative J, G, C, D, H, and E. That's the area between the social marginal cost curve and the private marginal cost curve all the way up to Q prime, the quantity that's being consumed. How about after the tax? What is our welfare calculation after the tax? So consumer surplus after the tax is just going to be the area under the demand curve down to the price the buyers are paying. So that's A. Producer surplus is going to be the area below the price the sellers are receiving down to the private marginal cost curve. Private because that's the supplier's marginal cost curve. It's we're not thinking about the social marginal cost yet. So the private marginal cost, that's going to be I and J. The government revenue after the tax is going to be the wedge. So let's put the tax on here. So the tax is this area here. So it's going to be the wedge between the prices the buyers are paying and the prices the sellers are receiving, all the way up to Q star. So that's going to be B, C, F, and G. Okay, and the externality changed a bit too, because now we're only consuming up to Q star. All right, so the externality is going to be the difference again between the social marginal cost and the private marginal cost. This is a negative because it's a bad thing. Up to Q star, where we're actually consuming with the tax. So that's J. That's a terrible J. That's J, G, and C. Okay, so let's look at the total surplus. How about in green? Let's do total surplus before the tax in green. All right, so we're going to add these up. We're going to add up these areas, subtracting off the externalities. So let's see where the externalities cross off here. All right, so we get A, B, F, I, and minus E. All right, total surplus before the tax is A, B, F, I. So that's that triangle in the graph to the left. Everything below the demand curve up to the social marginal cost curve, and we subtract off the externalities, so that's not in our surplus, and we have some deadweight loss. So deadweight loss before the tax is going to be this triangle here. So E is our deadweight loss before the tax. So now let's do the total surplus after the tax. Total surplus after the tax is going to be, let's cross these values off. Total surplus is A, B, I, and F. Okay. Well, now there is no deadweight loss. So we have removed the deadweight loss by imposing the tax. So the minus E is gone after we've imposed the tax. So now our total surplus after the tax is the same as our total surplus before the tax, except we have removed the deadweight loss. So what have we learned? So in a market without externalities, imposing a tax causes some inefficiency. It causes deadweight loss. In a market with externalities, there's deadweight loss before we impose a tax, and then imposing the tax removes that deadweight loss. So the tax is actually helpful in the market with externalities. The tax is not helpful in a market without externalities. So actually there's a thing that economists like to talk about called the double dividend, which means that we could use, suppose we have two markets like this. This is the income. Welfare without externalities is the income tax. So we know we're imposing some deadweight loss when we have an income tax. The government needs some revenue to pay for its services, so we need an income tax, or we need a property tax, or things like that. But we know that it imposes some deadweight loss. So we also know we have some markets with externalities that imposing a tax removes the deadweight loss. So in this market where we have an externality, we also have some revenue. So the government has some revenue. The revenue is going to be B and F. And the government can take this revenue and use it to offset the deadweight loss in this market. So the government can use that revenue from a market like an energy market with an externality. They can impose a tax, remove the externality. Well, they can't remove the externality. The externality is still there. They can remove the deadweight loss in the market with externalities, use the revenue to offset some of the deadweight loss created in the market without externalities like the income tax or the property taxes. So that's called a double dividend. Okay.